Hello and welcome to today's webinar, organized in the context of the Economics for Nature program. The Economics for Nature program is a collaborative initiative funded by the MAVA Foundation. It's focused on ensuring that nature has a voice in economic and planning processes. The program is led by the Green Economy Coalition, Capitals Coalition, WWF France, and the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership. I'm Ben Simmons and serve as the head of the GGKP Secretariat. We're extremely happy to have you with us today and hope this finds you all healthy and safe. This is the 6th webinar in our series on sustainability after COVID-19. We are delighted to be joined today by a distinguished panel of global experts who will explore the relationship between COVID-19 and nature, considering opportunities for investing in biodiversity and ecosystems to support long-term economic recovery from the pandemic. During the webinar, of course, please feel free to make comments through the questions box. It's a great opportunity to engage directly with the experts. A full recording of the webinar will be available on our website at ggkp.org. After the webinar, we would appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to complete our short survey. The feedback we receive helps us shape our future webinars. Our next webinar in this series will take place next week at the same time, and we'll explore the impact the pandemic is having on small and medium-sized businesses and supply chains, and we'll consider opportunities for building more resilience through resource efficiency. It is now my great pleasure and honor to introduce the moderator for today's event, Nozipho Tshabalala. Nozi is a conversation strategist, moderating global conversations that are designed to have measurable outcomes. She has an internationally acclaimed conference moderator and human capital advocate for the World Bank and Global Citizen. Nozi has many affiliations and has received a number of accolades throughout her career, and I would encourage you to take a look at her full bio. But she was in 2019 named as one of the top 100 most influential young Africans, and most recently as one of the top 100 most influential young South Africans. Nozi, I am delighted to welcome you to today's webinar and hereby turn the virtual podium over to you.
Thank you so much, Ben, for a very gracious introduction. It's an absolute honor for me to facilitate today's conversation. I'm incredibly excited about the stellar lineup that we have in terms of our panelists, and they're going to be really bringing in the experience and the insights to the big question today, our overarching question, which is how do we value nature in a post-pandemic world? I'm going to introduce them very briefly. I'm going to start off with Linda Manson. Linda, hello and welcome to you. Linda is the Director General of the MAVA Foundation, and this is one of the world's key funders of global conservation, with a particular focus on the world's iconic places and a focus on sustainable economy. Linda, it's fantastic to have you with us today. We're also joined by Nicole Liato. And Nicole is the Executive Director at CANARI, and CANARI is a globally recognized non-profit technical institute that contributes to the natural resource governance in the Caribbean, and this includes influencing policy as well as supporting capacity building initiatives. Nicole, hello and welcome to you. Fantastic to have you. We're also joined by Stephen Bullock. He goes by Steve on the good day. He is the global head of innovation and research at Trucost. Now, Trucost is part of S&P Global, and they really focus on assessing risk relating to climate change. They look at natural resource constraints and broader environmental, social, and governance factors. Steve, hi, lovely to have you in the conversation today. And last but certainly not least in the conversation, we're joined by Salman Hussain. Salman is the global coordinator at TEEB, which we know is the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. He's also head of Ecosystem Services Economics Unit at UNEP, that's the UN Environment Program, and has for the last decade focused on ecosystem service development. Now, as you can see, it's an incredible panel that are going to be leveraging their insights into this conversation. What I do want to say is that I'm also very interested in hearing what you have to say. So we have a live chat box. So as this conversation unfolds, If you have any questions or any comments that you'd like me to integrate into the conversation, you don't have to wait right till the end. Just pop them up in the chat box, and where possible, I will definitely be pulling those in to get your voices in. Now, when Ben started, now to my panelists, it was very clear that we have three big questions that we want to address today. We want to make a dot connect between nature and COVID-19. We want to explore what governments and businesses could do better in terms of valuing natural and social capital so that we're seeing more informed decision making. But we also want to look at the possibilities around investing in biodiversity and natural capital and how that can influence long-term economic recovery given the COVID-19 global crisis. And so I'm going to start right at the top. And Stephen, I'm going to ask you to kick us off with this conversation. What does nature have to do with COVID-19? How do we connect those dots?
Great. Well, thank you for the introduction. It's great to be here today to talk through some of these important issues. I mean, to get things started, I guess, we know that the exact origin of the COVID-19 virus is yet to be determined. But there is scientific evidence that shows us that 60% of infectious diseases originate from animals, and 70% of emergent infectious diseases originate from wildlife. There's also been a number of studies recently that show how deforestation and biodiversity loss can cause increases in infectious diseases. So I'm sure others will probably go into more detail on this on the panel. But I don't think it's any coincidence that the continued destruction of ecosystems around the world has also coincided with an increase in infectious diseases in recent years. But I think what's been interesting, perhaps in recent weeks, is the coverage that we've seen on the linkages between the pandemic and environmental and social issues. So to give you a few examples, we have satellite images showing improved air quality around the world in cities in Asia and Europe, for example. In China, carbon emissions are down by about 18% between February and March. We've seen goats overtake seaside towns in Wales in the UK. We've got people hearing birds singing in the cities. So, I think even though some of these, perhaps these indirect benefits from an environmental health and societal perspective might not offer a cause for celebration right now whilst we're focused on sort of tackling the pandemic, I think the crisis has really served as a really useful reminder that health, economic stability, and also nature are all interconnected. And I think this could hopefully lead to a better understanding of some of the ties that bind us on this global scale. And hopefully that's a cause for optimism as governments and businesses look to respond.
So ending on quite an optimistic note there, the opportunity for us to see through a singular lens, health, economic stability, and nature coming together. Interesting views there, Steve. I'm going to go to Salman next and just maybe lift from Salman, from where you sit, Salman, what does that dot connect, that connection between nature and COVID-19, what does it look like for you?
Well, thanks very much, and thanks for having me. And I'd say very much agree with what Stephen said, and he actually stole my thunder. In fact, the figure I thought was 75% of all emergent diseases come from wildlife. So I can trump your 50 or 70 and raise you 75. But basically, we know in terms of UN environment and the fact that our mandate in terms of looking at the environment, the interactions with livelihoods, that we know that we've been playing with fire. There's been significant, we don't know the exact causes of the pandemic, but we know that habitat loss, encroachment have led to us being uncomfortably close to plants and animals that harbor disease. Now, maybe being more pessimistic than optimistic in terms of Stephen, what we have seen also is an effect on nature from the lockdown, social distancing, and also the decrease in spending on conservation and protection. So for instance, Conservation International found that deforestation is at a 9-year high in Brazil, and a significant increase in illegal poaching. Now, some of that illegal poaching is coming, say, for bushmeat, because there's a loss of tourism income and there's a lockdown. So you see the kind of cyclical nature and the interrelatedness of different impacts, which sometimes make the situation worse, and typically that's the case. The vicious cycle because sometimes can make it better as well. The other thing I'd like to add to that, though, is I think what we've seen in terms of COVID-19 is we've seen something that I think many people might have foreseen or understood to be impossible, or as a minimum improbable, actually happening. That is, nature having this profound impact on humanity and human livelihoods. Okay. What's interesting here is economists and social scientists tend to think about something called the precautionary principle. The idea that even if the chances of a particular action or outcome arising are very small, if the impacts of that situation arising are cataclysmically high, then you ought to adapt your behavior just now. Now, when I was running a master's program at Edinburgh University, I would typically talk about the precautionary principle with respect to severe climate change, 6-degree climate change rise. And I would whimsically say to my students, I said, look, imagine I put out 500 gourmet sandwiches outside the room and they're free to you, but one of them is poisoned. Would you take the chance in indulging? Now, bizarre that analogy might be, the idea was they wouldn't, because they had an alternative means for nutrition. They go to the staff, they go to the canteen, etc. And the idea here is that everyone applies in that case the precautionary principle. If there's something cataclysmic that might happen but hasn't happened as yet, then you take action. Now, this is important, I think, in terms of nature, because we're seeing that the most obvious thing to say perhaps in the next 1.5 hours is that COVID-19 has happened. So you might not have anticipated it happening, but now we can think about, potentially not just a phase 2 of a second spike, but also COVID-21 or COVID-22. And so therefore, I think that we have to think about our relationship with nature and begin to apply the precautionary principle. In much the same way as with extreme climate change, there'll be those who will say, we will be shielded from it. We'll be shielded from the worst of it. It will happen over there. It won't happen over here. Or whatever I do as an individual is inconsequential. But COVID-19 has happened. We ought to think about the precautionary principle. We ought to redress the way we think about our relationship with nature. And I think, as Stephen said, this is an opportunity for us to do so. We have to think about who's going to pay for it, how we're going to measure it, how we can make it important in the public's eye. But I think it is an opportunity. Thank you.
Salman, lovely intervention there, and I love how you end with the range of questions, because if we begin to just reflect very briefly on what you've said, is that this is an opportunity to have a different conversation, to frame questions differently, because the possibility or the probability of a COVID-20, COVID-21 isn't this far-fetched idea anymore. And so we've almost been catapulted into a different conversation and a different reality. I do want to acknowledge the many hellos that are coming through on our chat from all over the world, South Korea, Amsterdam. I see all of you, and I am seeing your questions that are coming through. But I would like just to run through this first set of responses before I bring those voices in. And so let me go to Nicole next. And Nicole, it's exactly the same question. What does COVID-19 have to do with nature? We've had some really interesting contributions, and I'm keen to hear from your perspective as well.
Thanks. Well, hi everyone. And from a Caribbean perspective, we really see the intersection between nature, economic development, and COVID-19 intertwined. So the way I think about it is how economic development is really dependent on nature and is being hit by COVID-19 crisis. So I was really amazed to learn, I'm a biologist, and I learned that about half of the global GDP is moderately or highly dependent on natural ecosystems. And I think it's something that people forget. So COVID-19, the focus is on economic development, economic recovery, and we need to say nature and nature conservation and restoration and sustainable use is central to that. So, for example, a lot of these global businesses are dependent on nature and are going to be affected by COVID-19. I wanted to share the story of tourism in the Caribbean. The Caribbean is the most tourism-dependent region in the world, and the average about 15% of Caribbean GDP is dependent on tourism, which is by and large nature-based tourism, okay? And this is totally collapsing now because of COVID-19 restrictions on travel. So that whole industry has shut down. The Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, recently made a statement. I think some governments are seeing a third of their income for April gone, right? The IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, did a study recently saying COVID-19 is going to impact between 11 and 26% of tourism GDP, which for some countries is as high as 90% of their GDP. So for countries like Bahamas is at about 50%, for example. So this is a huge economic hit on nature-based businesses. And therefore, I know we're going to get to it later, but for me, keeping nature at the center of the economic recovery discussion is really critical if we are going to have the kind of economic development that we all want to see.
Fantastic, Nicole. Thank you very much for that. Again, some hard figures in terms of the potential impact on GDP just through the lens of the tourism industry, and this idea that perhaps what has been missing from the global conversation has been that interconnectedness when we look at nature-based businesses and the knock-on impact that has on economic stability. A huge conversation that you're bringing to light for us, Nicole. So Linda, I come to you next, again with the same question, the connection for you. What does nature have to do with COVID-19?
Well, the great benefit in going last is that I can sit here and say, I agree with what everyone else said, and just underline those messages. We really have seen now in a very direct and concrete way how the loss of biodiversity poses a risk to our economies, our way of life, and our health. It impacts the water we drink, the air we breathe, the food we eat, and now, as we see, causes global pandemics such as COVID. And when we disrupt the functioning and the balance of our ecosystems, we're only increasing those risks. And these aren't new risks. It wasn't that we didn't know they existed before. We globally, collectively failed to prepare for and imagine the scale of the economic impact for not caring for our functioning ecosystems. What we see is really a message that underlines the need for humans to live within the safe operating space of the biosphere. The Global Footprint Network every year publishes its Earth Overshoot Day, which is the day in the year by which we have used up the resources that the Earth can regenerate naturally. And after that, we're digging into reserves, so to speak, and that date has been moving forward steadily every year. And this month it's going to be a month later. So we've shifted an entire month, which just shows the impact that we humans are having on that. You just can't deny that what we do is impacting the world in ways that are leading to the kinds of effects that we have. I love what some of my fellow panelists have said about the opportunity now to frame the questions differently, and especially what Nicole said about making sure that nature is at the center of the economic recovery. And there's a few things that I can highlight that we're doing at MAVA, which is maybe a perspective different from my other panelists that I can bring, is out of the funders' perspective and some of the things we're seeing across the range of our partners. But you need to start with the basics of protecting high biodiversity sites. And that could be through protected areas or species conservation. And some examples that we fund would be the Bondarga in Mauritania, or the Djoudj National Park in Senegal, or the Bijagos Islands in Guinea-Bissau. You can also go back to restoring degraded areas and looking at the sustainable management of natural resources and landscape management. Some river basins that we support would be the Buna Delta in Montenegro or the Cebu in Morocco as some examples. And of course, the whole Economics for Nature program that we're supporting, which is also helping to bring you this webinar, this series of webinars, which is looking at incubating new ideas, building capacity, deepening the evidence, and really creating a new normal where natural capital is integrated in all decisions. And I think that's the key message we need to carry forward as we aim to rebuild, is to ensure that nature is part of the solution and is core to the discussions.
So Linda, really, really fantastic reinforcement. But what I really loved was your starting point around this deep self-reflection that we probably have to do as humanity. And your words are we've always known about the risks. The risks are not new, and we have failed to respond to those risks. And of course, the call to action to start with the basics. Now, the chat line has been going absolutely crazy with a lot of contributions. I want to pick up this one first because actually I recognize this name. This is one of the leading sustainability experts in South Africa who's on the call, on this webinar right now. Nomathemba Mhlanga, she says, the valuation of natural capital and ecosystem goods and services has historically been very, very difficult. How do we measure the impact of COVID on natural resources in a manner that is globally available? And what role do you see supply chains playing in addressing COVID and nature? Now, let me just get a quick flow of hands. Who really wants to take a first stab at that question? I'm seeing lots of body language going backwards, but Salman is going to take a bite of it. Let's get your response to that two-pronged question. Do we have globally recognized tools that we can use? And is there an opportunity to tap into supply chains to respond to this? Salman, what are your thoughts?
So on the first one, there's been actually, particularly in South Africa, a long-standing discussion around what we would term the commoditization of nature. The idea being that if we end up trying to put, particularly in monetary value, be it in rand or be it in US dollars, of ecosystem services, that is the benefits that ecosystems provide, the nature, the notion of natural capital, which is basically the contribution that well-functioning nature and ecosystems provide to our economy. If we call them ecosystem services, many take that to be a commoditization of nature. Now, that I think is if done incorrectly, if it's phrased that way, it becomes a dichotomy, but I think it's a false dichotomy. And the reason I say it's a false dichotomy is because what we've discovered, in fact, Stephen mentioned this in the introduction, what we discovered is things like more bird song. We're kind of reacting to less noise in the environment. We, as human beings, have a natural intrinsic value that we place on nature, okay? But just because we might, in terms of the corporate world or in terms of TEEB, the economic use of biodiversity, think sometimes it's appropriate, try to value that in both monetary and non-monetary terms isn't a contradiction to intrinsic value. Okay, we're not saying it doesn't exist. In fact, we're actually exaggerating that intrinsic value. We're trying to give more emphasis to it. But what we typically find, and we're going back to the supply chain question now, and this is very much Stephen's world, because he and I have interacted and he's worked for us before in the TEEB world, is that it tends to be the case that businesses are fairly hard-nosed. And we know that if we're going to try to make an impact in South Africa and indeed the rest of the world, we have to make the case, not just on intrinsic grounds, but actually make the bottom line case that this particular supply chain impacts on nature and is dependent on it. If you don't think about the extent to which you're dependent on well-functioning ecosystems, then you're basically not understanding the value of your supply chains and their susceptibility to that decline. So nature is doubly important in the COVID-19 world. Over.
So I've got two hands wanting to contribute to this. I'll go Linda first and Stephen next, but I'm going to use a quick facilitator superpower and just make a quick interjection here to say it's really interesting that sometimes when we make the case and present data, it doesn't always change behavior. And there's so many examples of that. For example, if we think of diversity as an example, we all know that diverse organizations perform better, and yet we still have a lot of undiverse companies around the world. So that's my little pushback to say, Salman, I hear you, but is making the case sufficient? So Linda, let me get your voice in, and then Stephen, I'll come directly to you and we'll then move on.
So coming on the heels of Hussein, I agree with what he says, that it's not a dichotomy between this utilitarian principle and the intrinsic value principle of nature. Of course, we need to value nature because of what it is and what we get out of it and how much we love it and the birdsong. But those arguments alone have not been effective. We relied on those arguments alone for decades, and that has not led to success. So I think we need to add into the toolbox the natural capital arguments. And the truth is, we have been putting a value on nature until now, but that value is zero. And this new approach increases the chances of having a greater value put into the equations. And I think that to get change to happen, we need governments and companies to actually see their self-interest in change. And valuing natural capital is one of the ways that you do that.
So Linda, you're taking us very close to our next question. So I'm going to come back to you very quickly on that. But let me just get Steve's quick comment here before we start looking at what governments and businesses can do.
Sure, and just very quickly, and just to build on Salman's point, I think what the COVID-19 outbreak has shown us is how things are interconnected, and how impacts can vary depending on the location. So different countries, different populations are affected differently. And I think in the context of the supply chain, what that also shows us is that we do need better data and better tools that help map out interactions across the supply chain, but also more work to look at the sort of geospatial nature of some of these things. So we have a lot of natural capital data sets available that are very location specific, but one thing I think that maybe is missing is how companies and their assets and their supply chains, where they are geolocated, so that we can start to build up a better picture of impacts and dependencies. And I think that is one area where hopefully more attention will be made in the coming months and years.
Fantastic. So I'm going to go to the chat, and I'm going to use a statement that's been made by Thiru Salvan to transition us to the next question. And Thiru says, there may have been a change in ecosystem values in places where countries were dependent on nature-based economies. Will localized planning could improve the situation in the near future? I'm going to just take that as a statement as we go into the next piece of our conversation, which is now really to look at how can governments and businesses better value natural and social capital if we are going to move towards more informed decision making. And I want to kick off with Nicole and get Nicole's views on this. And Linda, you were treading very close to this question, so I'm going to come to you straight after that. Nicole, let's start off with you.
Okay, thanks. Well, I have to say I was taken aback by the question asking how, because I'm no expert like Salman and Sivan, but I know that there are methods for doing this. And I think the key challenge, which I think some of the chat is bringing out, is the challenge on getting people to want to do it. As Linda said, we really don't have political and public widespread commitment to doing this. So the how is really a second step to getting people on board. And so, there are many barriers and challenges. Yes, we do have a lot of tools, but in some countries like the Caribbean where I am, we just don't have the data collected to feed into those tools and models and so on. So there's a basic data gap as well as technical competencies in the countries. But I think, getting to that agreement that it's needed and utilizing the very excellent tools that are available has to be the first step. And I think at the national level, what we really need to have is a much more participatory, integrated economic governance approach. So this is quite revolutionary, but there are examples of social compacts being used, where governments have mechanisms for meaningful dialogue systematically on economic development issues. For example, in Barbados, there's a very long history of this, and other countries. But I'm seeing that call, and as governments in the Caribbean are announcing, we need to develop our recovery packages, there is just an outcry from citizens, from civil society, from private sector. Well, we want our voices heard. We need to be part of this decision-making process. And in the same way, this issue of calling for valuing nature and utilizing the tools that are there is really critical. Now, I wanted to share one tool that has been developed that I think can be very useful in facilitating this participatory economic development, the economic governance exercise. And the Green Economy Coalition, which is one of the partners in this webinar series, and CANARI is a member, others here, has developed something they call the Green Economy Tracker. It's online, it's an online tool, and it is provides a series of indicators under 5 themes that allow for conversations nationally to say, how are we doing? What is it we need to do, and how are we doing? What do we need to do more of? And there's one specific theme that focuses on nature and has all of the things that Salman will be talking about, and the natural capital accounting, the having national committees to provide independent expert input, the fiscal and monetary frameworks, removing perverse subsidies, moving that money into positive subsidies, supporting conservation. So that's one tool I wanted to highlight. It can be an example. But these kinds of conversations to bring stakeholders together on valuing nature, and then we can get the experts on board with all their fantastic tools and models. Thanks.
So incredible contribution there, Nicole. Firstly, with a very real reflection on, do we have the data and the quality of data that we need, and do we have the tools and the models to move us to address that how? But you're raising for us a big flag here to say, are we on the same why, right? So before we get to the how, and of course zeroing in on dialogue. I just want to read a quick question, not for discussion, that's coming from Monica Tata. And the reason I'm reading this question is that I think it shows the spectrum of the conversation around the data point. And Monica says this, Nicole, she says, are there tools in place to avoid unintended profiting? Oh, my screen is jumping. Unintended profiting from the collection of big data for the immense hunger shown by corporations worldwide, described as surveillance capitalism. So quite controversial, and we don't shy away from difficult questions in these webinars, but it's an interesting take on the data perspective to say there's also another risk and another conversation that we have to be alive to. So Linda, let me come to you next. You made the point that we've always been valuing nature. The only difference is that we've been putting a zero in the equation. So the question back to you again, how can governments and businesses better value natural and social capital, and perhaps the linkage to more informed decision making as well?
So I think the first thing is for governments and businesses to realize just how much their country or company depends on the healthy state of natural resources. And this comes back to the self-interest argument. I think when you look at the statistic that Nicole put out there, that is half of the world's GDP, $44 trillion of economic value generation, depends on nature. How can you not see your self-interest in that? Now, we know GDP is not the best measure of success and well-being, but it is the one that governments pay attention to at the moment. And I don't think that we can see the damage to nature from economic activity as an externality anymore. The effects are direct and fundamental, and they affect companies, supply chains, markets, and reputation. At the World Economic Forum every year does its assessment of the big global risks, and the top 5 risks this year were all environmental. And this is not an environmental group who's doing these risks. These are business people and world leaders who are saying that the risks are large. The top 5 risks are related to the environment. And so both companies and countries need to assess the risk they have to limited access to natural resources or their degraded quality, for example, the supply of clean water, and the effect that has on their operations and their ability to thrive. And these risks then need to be integrated into the core strategies and not seen as something on the side. So for a company, that means its core risk strategy needs to look at nature risks. And for a company, that means its national development plans needs to include natural capital What we often see now is these plans look really mainly at climate change and carbon emissions, but it also needs to really include a look at nature in there as well. One of the things that we're supporting, thank you, Nicole, for mentioning it, is the Green Economy Tracker with the Green Economy Coalition that we're very proud of. Another thing we're supporting is the Global Commons Alliance and the Science-Based Target Network that is helping to translate global science into targets for cities and companies. And this would be a tool to help both see specifically what they can do to move in a better direction.
Sure. So lots of really interesting things. And when you started talking about the responsibility of governments and businesses to assess their own risk, I saw Steve really begin to nod his head there vigorously. So I'm going to come to him next. But the call to action is very clear here, Linda, that you put to us is that if it is not in your core strategy, if it is not in your national development plan, that's usually a good sign that you have put zero in the equation and you really haven't valued it. So I'm going to throw it to Steve because I'd really love to get your sense on this. Again, we've got fantastic questions coming through, but I'll bring in some of those voices once we've heard from Salman as well. So Steve, let me hear from you. Lots of nodding in reinforcement of Linda, but I'm sure you've got your ideas around what government and business can do.
Sure, thank you. I think, and I think Salman made this point in his opening remarks as well, that, there's been quite a few lessons we've learned as the pandemic has unfolded. But probably one of the most important ones is that these kind of high probability, high impact risks must be acted upon in a timely fashion, and delay can often be costly. Back in January, which I think feels like a long time ago now, the World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report put biodiversity loss and climate inaction, as well as extreme weather events, as the highest risks in terms of likelihood and impact. And I think what the pandemic has highlighted again, if we didn't need reminding, is that the importance of these known unknowns, these kind of known possibilities that are present in the background, but maybe for which we are not fully prepared. And I think I would put biodiversity loss and climate change, of course, into that bucket. So I think for more informed decision making, we really need the right tools and the right data sets so that governments and companies and investors as well can really understand their impacts and dependencies on nature. And I think the Capitals Coalition is doing great work in this area, worthy of mention here. But I think it really demonstrates that the real importance for things like scenario analysis and stress testing, so that market participants, whoever they might be, can start to reassess these risks and opportunities and really kind of build resiliency, in how they respond. Maybe just very quickly from a practical viewpoint, we recently did a little bit of work to see how companies could kind of bounce back and go back to work in a way that was perhaps more aligned with our global goals or our planetary limits. We focused on a few different areas of business. We looked at air travel, employee commuting, and shipping. And just to give you a few insights from that, we found that if businesses were to promote video conferencing, but also reduce air travel by 40%, then the whole aviation sector would be aligned with a climate goal by 2030. And then also reshoring production, buying locally for just 7% of international goods would put the shipping sector on a climate aligned pathway by 2030. So these are just a few examples, and it's not to say that implementing them won't be difficult. Of course, we can broaden these out as well to broader kind of biodiversity and wildlife loss issues. But I think, again, it does give the presenters with this opportunity to kind of consider these broader issues as governments and businesses start to re-emerge.
So, Steve, thank you. Fantastic. Again, just to bring us back to one of the earlier points I think Nicole had also made around data, tools, and models, and making sure that you actually have those tools, you have those toolboxes, but you also have the right data sets, as you've said. Again, you're taking us into the territory of stress analysis and scenario planning, but it's all in the name of resilience. And I'm interested as how Salman's going to pick up from this, because, listening to what you've said, the case is clear. And Salman, I'll be the first one to admit that I was the one pushing against this idea that if we make a case for something, it does drive behavior. But let me bring your voice in here. Again, on the very same question, what can government and businesses do to better value natural and social capital? And again, to bring it to the link of more informed decision making.
Thanks. I mean, just a few responses. I think that as the coordinator of the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, you might anticipate that I spend 70% of my time looking at econometric models of valuation. I probably spend less than 10% of my time doing that. Most of the people in the team, to answer Nicole's point, are actually talking to stakeholders to work out what exactly is the right policy question. So we start, I mean, valuation is a human process. There's no such thing as valuation in the abstract. It's a human construct, right? And so what we're trying to do is to say, if we're in TEEB, what we're saying is, let's talk the really important word that was used as scenarios. And this also, I think, Nozi talks to why it is that change doesn't happen just through valuation. Now, what typically happens in terms of what I would call non-policy driven valuation is that there'll be a series of researchers who will look at the total value of a forest for the sake of argument, okay, and present that to national government. Now, those in national government may respond to that, but my experience is in all likelihood, they'll kind of do a shrug. What do I do with that information? Okay, I've just learned that my forests are really valuable and that they're being depleted, but what do I do about it? And so this is why in TEEB, everything is driven by scenario analysis. So the only way to get policymakers, and by policy I'm using a broad term, both at national level and also at business level, to make a change based on the valuation, is first to present a business as usual scenario, and then look at a counterfactual, an intervention. Let's go back to Nicole's point. There's absolutely no point in considering an intervention for which the governance doesn't exist, for which the stakeholder buy-in doesn't exist, such that once we do the valuation, if we get a very good benefit cost ratio, meaning, you know, it's a very good investment of our time and money to do this, okay? But before that, way before that, we have to ask, I would ask the following question: is there any point in me doing this valuation? I'm only going to be taking this forward with public money if it is the case that the governance is in place, the stakeholders want to know the answer to this question, and that those who can make the decision are empowered to make the change if the results show us it makes sense to do so. So 9 out of 10 valuations are simply saying the forest is worth X million dollars. Can't do anything with that information. You can do very little with that information. Whereas if you say our investment in protecting that forest would reap these benefits in terms of carbon sequestration, in terms of watershed management, in terms of pollination service, in terms of non-timber forest products, if we can do that and say this is what it would actually cost to have that intervention take place, these are the benefits that accrue, this is the constituencies of winners and losers. That's also really important, okay? For 2 reasons. Political economy. If you're not aware who's going to push back against the evidence you're providing, then you're not going to get it through, okay? And secondly, in TEEB and in UNEP, of course, we're completely concerned about distributional impacts. So what was mentioned before was basically what we call the GDP of the poor. Now, we are extremely dependent on the state of our natural environment. But those who are the least able to find an alternative, those who are most disenfranchised in society, the poorest in society, are disproportionately affected by the reduction in the quality of our natural environment. So what we need to do is look at, provide a scenario, provide it to business, provide it to governments. Make sure that scenario is one, sorry, not provide, but listen to and then develop a scenario, I should say. Make sure that scenario is credible. Get stakeholders on board to start with, then do the biophysical assessment of what the changes might be, then value them, and then make the case. So TEEB has this kind of tagline: recognize, demonstrate, and capture. Now, even when we get to the first bit of that, which is just telling people, businesses, international leaders, just recognize that pollination, watershed management are hugely valuable. As Linda said, they aren't zero. Here's a value for them. These would be depleted if the ecosystem goes into decline. If you decide to allow agricultural encroachment, you will no longer enjoy the benefits of these services. Your economy will be in decline as a consequence. If you can make that case in a structured way, we have found people do listen. We've found that in terms of businesses, for sure, and Stephen's been working on that. You mentioned the national development plans, Nozi. And Indonesia, for the first time earlier this year, included agroforestry in its 5-year national development plan. And that was based, at least in significant part, by a very short-lived TEEB study, which looked at agroforestry, looked at ecosystem services, provided the value of those services, and now we have an agroforestry strategy in Indonesia. So there are real examples. It can happen, but you've got to look at scenarios. It's got to be stakeholder driven. It's got to be participatory, to think what Nicole was saying. Absolutely. You've got to ask the right questions, be rigorous. And even in data poor environments, we typically work in very data poor environments. There's enough that we can do to give an evidence base that can lead to valuation being useful and creating positive change for conservation and livelihoods.
So Salman, thank you for that. And one of the things you started off with is, are we actually asking the right policy question, right? Which I think is often missing in these conversations as we go down a rabbit hole in search of answers to a question that actually has no contextual relevance to that particular place. Now, I did make a promise to the participants that I was going to bring in some of their voices, and I'm literally going through some of the questions, and I want to bring this up. Jonathan Fish has been very active, and Jonathan just wants to reaffirm one of the statements that Salman has made. He says, 100% agree with Salman. How we get the right questions on the decision making, we have to get the right questions on the decision making agenda so that we can work up collaboratively and ensure that the assessments then feed in and are given due consideration. So he's reaffirming and coming back to this idea that the worst case is even working together on the wrong question. So we have to really make sure that we're asking the wrong question, the right question, that is. There is a question that was raised by Marilyn from the Philippines. It's escaped me now, but I do remember the question from the top of my mind, and I want to bring it back into the conversation, and perhaps let me bring it to Nicole, because Nicole, you raised the issue of participatory and stakeholder-driven interaction, because Marilyn's question was, are we even having conversations with grassroots communities? I'm seeing a lot of talk about business and government. I'm not hearing about the people who are actually living amongst and within nature. A quick comment from you on that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because a lot of these conversations take place at this level, you know, and including using technology like we are now, which is not accessible to a lot of people. It's not a forum that they're comfortable with, and they actually may not have the tools. So, I mean, I could share what we're doing in the Caribbean, where we really are working at the grassroots level with the especially coastal communities, but all communities in rural areas whose livelihoods depend on nature, right? And you know, this needs to not be an esoteric discussion for them. They live in nature. I think they don't even realize how much it is a part of their psyche. But, you know, really go into them with the livelihood focus. And what we've been really doing is working with local green and blue enterprises. So, you know, these are informal or formal micro enterprises that they use nature for their business, whether it's harvesting sea moss or community-based tourism or some type of forest product. And we've been working with them to look at their business and say, you know, how can you make your business green? How can you make your business deliver social benefits, economic benefits, strengthen? So that triple bottom line that we all traditionally use. So we developed a very simple tool called the Local Green Enterprise Radar, which is a capacity building self-assessment tool to have those conversations at the grassroots level, using a frame that is a priority to them, their livelihood frame. And the kind of responses we're getting are, you know, oh, now I see how I am part of a green economy. Now I see how I am part of a blue economy. So you can connect to people where they are.
So a beautiful way of again, framing the conversation around the reality of the people that we're connecting and engaging with. Linda, I see your hand is up and I'm gonna come to you now. I just wanted to get to a quick comment here. I love this comment, and the reason I love it is that as much as it's a difficult comment, I do believe that real conversations happen when we really push each other to get to better truths. So there's a comment by Tim Viskel here, and Tim says, the arrogance of our discussion here, as if we, in capital letters, as humans, are the center of biodiversity. What is the value of the white ant or any ants? And oh, sorry, I've jumped from there. He says, as if we're the center of biodiversity. And essentially, he says, value is not a cost. You can't get any closer to value questions by looking at cost. And although this question started off as if it was a really pushback against the conversation, I think it's a real affirmation of the points that Salman was making in his last contribution, to say that you need to position the value of biodiversity in terms of its benefits to the various stakeholders, and not necessarily have a singular narrative of positioning it as a cost. So Tim, thank you for that contribution. And I believe that you might have been covered by Salman's response. So let me get to Linda before we get to our last theme in the conversation. Your comment, Linda.
So I wanted to pick up on the theme of the previous question. Then I want to say something about this new question, this new comment. So I can do both at the same time. So the first one is just about working with local communities, and that is something that we do a lot at MAVA. I mean, the focus of this discussion is very much on companies and countries. Those are the way our questions were framed, so we tend to be talking about that. But it all starts with working with the local communities and the grassroots groups. We work with all of the places that we work, in any of the areas we're trying to protect, any of the species we're trying to protect. If the local communities aren't involved, you will fail. And so we work with them to help them understand the value nature has for them, what it brings to them, even in cases where they're nature dependent. Sometimes, you know, the alternatives seem very, very attractive, but when you can help them think it all the way through, or show them some of the numbers or some of the arguments, that can sway things. And another powerful way of going about that is linking to cultural values. And we have a whole program on culture and nature throughout the Mediterranean. But the example I want to give is one in Cabo Verde, where we're working on sea turtle conservation and working with local communities to create a local identity that has the sea turtle as their emblem, as their mascot, as something that they're proud of, that they want to help save and preserve, and that they understand all of the tourism that comes from that, but it becomes their emblem. And I think that helps anchor the value of nature in a broader sense, but you have to do it starting with the local communities. I just want to say a word about the other comment about the arrogance of the discussion. I completely understand that, but I would argue that the arrogance is in not paying attention to nature in the discussion, and that if we want to understand our positioning within nature, that does require us to be more humble and understand that we're just one little part of it. So I'm feeling like the discussion is taking us away from arrogance rather than toward it.
So lovely, thank you for that. And I think I've loved the anchoring of humility in the conversation, and the call to adventure, to review the equation and the values that we've been popping into that equation for the longest time. I'm still seeing lots and lots of questions coming through, but I am anxious that we get to the final theme and then spend a little bit of time towards the end in engaging with some of the questions. Now, the final theme really is around investment, and you know, there's a general sense that our house is on fire and incremental changes just won't do this time around. And so the question is, how can investment in biodiversity and natural capital support long-term economic recovery from the COVID-19 fallout? So how do we really take on a long-term lens, and how do we invest with that particular worldview? Steve, I'm going to start off with you. I haven't started with you in a while, so let me get your views on this. How do we get a long-term lens and a long-term investment strategy post pandemic?
Sure, thank you. So, I mean, I think it's certainly paramount that governments around the world embrace economic stimulus packages that really kind of promote sustainable growth. Okay, I guess more explicitly combining health, economic stability, but also, of course, environmental protection. I mean, first and foremost, it makes business sense. I think we've all kind of cited the report a number of times about, you know, how over half of the world's GDP is highly or moderately dependent on nature. Nature provides businesses and governments with vast opportunities. I think there's been some encouraging developments in the kind of initial responses. I think the European Union is probably showing the way. Just last week, you know, confirming that 25% of all the funding relating to the recovery will be set aside for climate action. Obviously, there's work to be done to ensure that happens, and money doesn't maybe drip into more carbon-intensive sectors. A couple of weeks ago, we also saw that Canada included a condition about its bailout funding to say that companies would need to disclose climate risk, which again is these are all welcome developments. But I think perhaps the rise of ESG investing over the past decade is worth noting here. You know, that grew around about 35% in 2 years between 2016 and 2018. And even as the pandemic has unfolded, investors have continued to pour money into sustainable funds. Just to give you an example, around about $45 billion was put into ESG funds in the first quarter of this year, compared to outflows of 400 billion from the entire fund universe. So I think it really starts to demonstrate the stickiness of ESG investments. ESG investors are typically driven by their values, have a longer term perspective. They seem hopefully more unnerved by kind of periods of bad performance, but actually it was encouraging to see that as of April 6th, I think, the S&P 500 ESG index was actually outperforming the S&P 500 by about 2.5%, which is significant. But I think it's perhaps more importantly shows just the summarize here that, you know, investors are starting to signal a preference for companies and products that have a positive societal impact, and that seems to be more important now than ever, and is kind of promising in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals as well. So I think more clearly needs to be done to ensure that capital markets are pricing in natural capital more transparently. But I think the continued growth of sustainable investment is a strong signal that capital is starting to flow maybe more readily to sustainable assets. But obviously, we will have to see how economic stimulus packages unfold and how this kind of latent growth in ESG investing continues over the next months and years ahead.
Okay, fantastic. So really speaking to the stickiness and the attractiveness of ESG investing and how it's relatively outperformed the capital markets. But again, I'm hearing from you, Steve, call to action that we actually need to start pricing in natural capital into mainstream capital markets if we're really going to get a good valuation on this. So I'm going to come to Linda next. Before I'm going to go Linda, Salman, and then I'll come to Nicole. And again, I've got a buzz of questions that I need to get to you, but let me get Linda's voice in first.
So firstly, I'd like to support what Steve just said about integrating natural capital into investment decisions. But when you look at how we're going to manage the recovery, the economic recovery from the COVID fallout, I really think that the time is ripe to make sure that nature is at the center of the economic recovery. A recent poll in the UK showed that 8 out of 10 people say they want to prioritize public health over economic growth. You've got world leaders like Macron making statements that protecting ecosystems can prevent pandemics like COVID. We've seen the massive economic impacts of this crisis, and we can't ignore that going forward, because this surely will not be the last time we're confronted with this kind of thing. We just need to make sure that the actions that we take don't amplify the risks of future outbreaks. And to me, that means strengthening and reinforcing environmental regulations, kind of the opposite of what the U.S. is doing right now. But probably that's a good strapline for anything. Just do the opposite of what the U.S. is doing right now. One of the things that we are supporting is an index that is rating how green the stimulus packages are. And I have to say that after 2008, when there were such clear lessons from the bailout packages that were put out there and the behavior that it led to and the missed opportunity to have some better outcomes, I'm really disappointed that we're not applying those lessons more broadly here. As we see, stimulus packages of about $840 billion US have been announced. Vivid Economics analysis shows that 11% of those will flow into sectors that have very high impacts on the environment, whether that's climate change, biodiversity, or pollution, or whatever. And we have some examples like Canada, which I'm so happy to see, but I really wish we could see broader examples of that. I think we need to see it just right across the board, that there are more conditions attached to receiving stimulus funding.
So how green is your package? Essential question that you're saying should be right at the forefront. I do want to bring a quick question from Robin to you, Linda, because I think it relates very closely to what you've just shared with us. And I'm going to try and pull it back here on my screen as there we go. So Robin Fontaine says, should the long-term lens be based on education of the digital and environmental transition to promote job creation? And I'm bringing this question to you, Linda, because in light of what you've just said, if we can also put the case that this is actually going to create X number of green jobs in the process as well, surely this then becomes another opportunity that is ripe for exploitation. Your thoughts on Robin's contribution?
Yes, completely agree. I mean, this is an opportunity to build an argument going in that direction. One of the things that we're supporting, which kind of is one of the fundamentals for this, is reforming economics education. Because the current neoclassical model would just never take that into account, doesn't take into account any of the environmental or social costs and benefits that we would like to see integrated into things. So we kind of have to start back at the basics and reform the way people are initially taught how the world works, economists, and I mean, I'd like to see it integrated all across curricula. But that would be one example of trying to start seeing the value of this shift that Robin talks about.
Fantastic, thanks, Linda. So Salman, let me come to you next. Again, I want to bring the long-term lens. How can investment in biodiversity and natural capital support the long-term economic recovery post-COVID-19? Your thoughts on this question?
Thank you. Well, just a quick aside, Linda, I was an economist by training. My first degree with ecological economics and taught it for about 20 years. So I'm on your side there. Just to say, I think Steve made a number of points I was going to make. Let me add one more. What we hear a lot about is the excellent proposals, Macron was mentioned, the EU was mentioned, for stimulus packages within the developed world, within the global north. Now, one thing that was actually raised today was 3 former UK prime ministers requesting that we have an extraordinary meeting of the G20 for coordination, and also a call for stimulus packages to be supported from the global north to the global south for post-COVID-19 recovery. And I think that's at least as important as looking at green jobs in the global north. And the reason I say that is because I think we're probably, most of us are on this call, I mean, 300 participants are aware that biodiversity tends to be located in the global south. The conservation of that biodiversity, the preservation of that biodiversity, the reduction in risk of a pandemic, of a new pandemic, the reduction in the risk in terms of catastrophic climate change, etc. Those lie with the decisions that are being made in the global south. Now, of course, we influence them. We influence them by looking at our consumption behavior, so we can look at sustainable consumption and production. So we certainly shouldn't attribute any ills or wrongs that happen in the world to the global south. But in a situation where there is such massive borrowing, where the priority will be to deal with, circa average 10% unemployment in the global north, it may well be very easy to forget that actually our decision in that regard to prioritize our own backyard is actually counterproductive, because these are global public goods that are being provided. And our recovery strategy must account for that, even if we're doing it, as Linda said, in an entirely self-interested way. Self-interest in this case is, say, for instance, the UK government, or indeed the American or Swiss government, saying it's in our interest to make sure there isn't a new pandemic. It's in our interest to make sure that biodiversity is preserved in the global south. We're not doing it just because we believe in the goodness of our heart we should be doing it, but actually there's an extra reason. And the pandemic and the reason to avoid a future pandemic has given new impetus to that. Now, we have to be more precise in terms of what actions we need to take to avoid a future pandemic, but that should be adding to our toolbox. It should be adding to the insights that we provide to push the agenda for building back better. Taking into account, for instance, how we can deal with agricultural encroachment, which is happening more and more, as I mentioned in the opening remarks, because of a lack of control, a lack of enforcement, because budgets are being cut, environment ministries globally. So that's one thing I think that's really important. We have to be able to account for and allow for that. And the final point is a term that's used in climate change is often maladaptation. That's when basically you try to adapt, but you get it completely wrong. Now, there's a real possibility, particularly in terms of agriculture, to have maladaptation, because we've been fighting in UNEP and amongst other entities to try to move towards regenerative agriculture, move towards agriculture which is in tune with, as Linda said, kind of global boundaries and global limits that apply. Now, if it's clearly we're just now facing a situation, we know this from the head of the World Food Programme, of potential, famines of biblical proportions. Now, an immediate reaction might be intensify. Okay, fertilizer price may well go down because fossil fuel prices are down, but that would be completely the wrong response. We know that from TEEB analyses, because the long-term consequences of that, or medium-term consequences, are actually lower food availability and a lower ability to deal with fluctuations in food availability. So we have to avoid maladaptation, particularly in terms of the agricultural sphere. Over.
Fantastic, thank you, Salman. Again, such richness from the contribution. So raising this emergent idea that we should potentially be looking beyond our own backyards, and that there might be an opportunity here to really see a flow of long-term investment from the north into the south, and the caution, of course, there around maladaptation. And I'm seeing reaction to the chat from that. Nicole, I'm keen to get your voice in here. We remain on the long-term lens conversation as we begin to think about economic recovery post-COVID-19.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think just to add to the wonderful points made, I feel I'm learning so much. I think one thing I think about in this is the channel for investment. And I want to make a push for the micro, small, and medium enterprises and a focus on them as a pathway. They represent 90% of businesses, more than 50% of GDP, 50% of employment globally, a huge sector. And, decades talk about how do we unleash the potential of this sector and so on. And no more time better than now. And I think, how can investment towards ecosystems and nature really think about how we can support these businesses to green their practices? How can we support them to actually deliver solutions, to innovate, and to actually contribute to the ecosystem restoration that is so desperately needed? How can we ensure that the many who are going to become unemployed and usually turn to nature as their social safety net, how do we, support them to get back into business, to develop micro enterprises, sustainable livelihoods, and really prevent what Salman started talking about? We're seeing some of the destructive practices in nature already happening now. So I think really just putting focus on the MSME sector and what role they can play, and not forgetting the informal and the micro, which are extremely challenging and really not being targeted by current programs. And I think the time is now for really reforming legal, policy, regulatory, fiscal frameworks to better support that sector, to provide incentives for greening, to provide funding for innovation, to provide proper frameworks for social and green enterprises, to really encourage this movement. Thanks.
So Nicole, thank you very much. Mapping beautifully into a couple of the points that were made earlier. So as we talk about informal and micro sectors, even before we talk about small and medium-sized enterprises, reinforcing this surfacing of the South in the conversation, because we know if we look at Africa, for example, that most economies are actually predominantly, informal. In terms of the market activity there, and that micro enterprises are by far one of the ways that a lot of people realize their livelihoods. Just want to say that when Ben started this webinar, he did mention that this time next week, same time, same place, the conversation is going to be on small and medium-sized enterprises. So I don't doubt that some of the questions you've raised, and Nicole, are going to filter them and make their way into that conversation. Now, I've got a screen that is absolutely going crazy with questions. So in the last couple of minutes, I'm going to try to do justice to some of those questions by posing them to you. All right, so let me come back to and bring this question to Steve. Steve, this is a question from Andrea Quintanilla. I hope I'm saying that correctly. And Andrea says, hello, everyone. I'm from Mexico. I'm a student at Boston University. Thank you for an exceptional webinar. And he then says, I agree with the importance of reforming economic education. And I do think the instruments of ESG funds and impact investing can play a role in the economic recovery of our countries. I would love just for you, it's not so much a question more as it's a comment, Steve, but I think the opportunity here is to look at ESG investing and then bring in the lens of the South that Salman had begun to bring into the conversation. What does that opportunity look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important point. And, I mentioned the appetite for investors to direct capital towards more sustainable assets, and the inflows, are incredible, considering, we're going through one of the biggest kind of economic turmoil, excuse me, in recent memory. But I think, there is certainly opportunity to broaden that global perspective and include investments in developing countries and other areas where perhaps there's been some barriers in kind of international capital or global equity markets in the past. So I think that it's upon investors and financial institutions to kind of develop and integrate those types of investment themes into the funds and investment portfolios and products that they're developing. But there's certainly appetite for that, and I can only hope that continues to accelerate as we move out of the pandemic.
Fantastic. Salman, I'm bringing you a question that is really at a global level, and the question comes from Hazrat Hussein, who says, do we have any protocols that governments can use to grant approvals for recovery packages where natural preservation is committed in value share allocation? So do we have sort of frameworks and protocols that we can look to?
So the most obvious one, there's a renegotiation. It was meant to be in a physical meeting in China for the Conventional Biological Diversity, the CBD COP this year, where it was basically meant to be the development of the post-2020 agenda, which is following on from 10 years from the previous working up of that. There are, I don't have tips my fingers the number of signatories, but the vast majority of member states are signatories to the CBD COP. That, as well as the UN Convention on Climate Change, Framework Convention on Climate Change, and on certification, etc., are aspects which targets are developed in the same way we have nationally determined contributions for climate change. Targets are developed. They aren't mandatory. But nonetheless, they're targets which sovereign nations will commit to, and there are negotiations therein to see what is fair in terms of international balance in terms of those commitments.
Fantastic. So there are some frameworks that we could look to. I've got a question that came in really early, Linda, that I'm going to bring to you. It's a question that came from Satabati Dati. And Satabati was saying, what could be some of the indicators of social capital that can be quantified at micro and macro level? So if we really get practical about this, what are the indicators that we could look to begin to say, okay, these can be quantified and we can use these to put a value to social or natural capital?
Is the question about social capital or both social and natural capital?
There's social capital. So what could be some of the indicators of social capital that can be quantified at a micro and macro level?
Right. We don't do any work on social capital. We focus really on natural capital. Obviously, there are linkages with social capital, so I'm really not the best person to answer that question.
Do I have a show of a hand of anyone who wants to take a stab at it, at Satabad's question response? So what are our social indicators when we start to look at a social capital rather than natural capital? I'm going to choose the person. We're going to go with the economics professor.
Well, I'm struggling to know a better answer than I do. I was going to nominate Steve actually because he worked on the capital school. So there we are. I can't do that. There are ways of looking at I've got some mad, but kind of social cohesion. To what extent, say, for instance, social cohesion improved? So you can look at, say, for instance, the extent to which a community has been involved in a particular decision and try to measure that through, say, for instance, a survey-based approach. And also look at the networks that have been as network analysis that can be carried out to look at the strength of networks that are applicable to the decision-making process and the extent to which they are genuinely participatory in nature. So I think that often in terms of social capital, you kind of look at where it's failed, okay? So where social capital has failed is when you've got kind of monolithic institution making the decisions and the governance structure is such that there's very little empowerment of those in terms who are affected by the decision. And those are the kind of negatives you can measure relative to those negatives. But there's an evolving literature in that. Yeah.
All right, fantastic. Thanks, Salman, Salman on that, picking up on social capital. Steve, I will come to you with a question from Andrew, but before I do that, I want to go to Nicole and to bring this question to you, Nicole, from Marilyn Delator. And Marilyn says, again, thank you so much for this webinar. And here's the question: what kind of green jobs could we support that would promote biodiversity-friendly enterprise, which would involve communities as part of biodiversity conservation? So also a question to say, do we have an idea in the universe of jobs and job creation opportunities, what can we support that we know is going to have a net positive and green impact in the long term? For you, Nicole.
Thanks so much for the question. And I think I can only speak well from the Caribbean context, but there are very many nature-based enterprises or jobs, but what we work with are really micro entrepreneurs. So they're creating their own jobs in their communities. So immediately they're delivering a lot of social benefits, actually. And there are a lot of very good examples of small micro enterprises at the grassroots level that are doing work on community-based tourism, for example, around, Linda talked about sea turtles. And in Northeast Trinidad, there's a very lovely model of several decades of work by local grassroots communities protecting turtles on the beaches as part of a conservation and tourism program where visitors pay to go on the beach and pay a guide. And then there's a whole community-based protection effort alongside that, and actually research as well. And they've branded themselves as Turtle Village. So all the villages in Northeast Trinidad, there are big signs up, welcome to Turtle Village of Matura, welcome to Turtle Village of Celibia. And so they really have framed their entire livelihood as centered around protecting nature and getting economic benefits. They're fantastic examples. Now we're working with communities in bays in several Caribbean islands where they harvest a floating algae. So they actually grow it on ropes, and it's called sea moss locally, and it's used to make drinks and of course rum punch and lovely ice cream and so on. and they are there. They need very clean coastal water. So they're really committed to doing what they can at that very local level to ensure that their bays, their coasts are healthy, because their crop depends on it. So I think there are lots of very good examples at this level. The key issue is how can we effectively support them to scale up? How can we put the enabling policies, regulations, financing to support these fantastic models so that they can share with others and these models can be spread, and all over the world this is happening.
Fantastic. So again, a really practical example, but the challenge that you're putting to us is it's a challenge of scaling. Again, the opportunity to borrow, I think it was Salman's earlier phrase, to go beyond just our own backyards. Now, Steve, I know I said I was going to come to you with a question from Andrew, but I'm caught by a question from Nigeria right now that is being posed by Stella Ndima Ayika. And Stella says, I'm from Yaba College of Technology in Lagos, Nigeria. And she says, financing agriculture, oh, there goes my screen jumping, so I'm going to try and find it. Oh, there we go. She says, financing agricultural projects has been picked up as the new important investment. Do we have any models that keep and use records of the resultant effect as social and economic capital development? So, and again, I think here it's a big focus. Agricultural investments is a big focus in Nigeria, but the question really is, do we have models that we could look to that really can create the linkage to social and economic capital development? Any thoughts from you for Stella?
Sure. I mean, recently we've been looking at positive impact through the lens of the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is actually looking at investment portfolios and companies and assets that investors have directed capital towards, and looking at how aligned they are with all of the Sustainable Development Goals. And what that obviously does then is kind of integrate the economic, the social, and health lens as well, and really help quantify and understand the sort of impact of that investment across those different lenses. And I think this generally kind of serves to this kind of shift in capital markets from one of looking at risk and exposure to nature and environmental ESG issues to one of impact. And I think we're definitely seeing a move towards more transparency around impact, and the SDGs I think offer a really good lens for that, and a way to track progress as well. So yeah, I would say that is certainly something, you know, there are data sets and analytical tools emerging that can help us do that.
So I've got a few minutes left in this webinar, and so Salman, let me get your quick comment before I begin to get your wrap up inputs.
Sure. So one thing that hasn't been mentioned so far in this webinar, we talked about natural capital and social capital, the kind of social cohesion. But the other element which Steve mentioned, I thought it's worth highlighting, which similar to what Linda said about natural capital, tends to have a zero value, is also the human capital. Now that's kind of our human ingenuity. And it can also be linked also to just human health. All right. So one of the things we're finding in particular is there a need to actually look across the piece at all 3/4 of these capitals. So the thing that's typically measured is what's called productive capital, stuff that appears in GDP measures. But we should also add to that the human, the social, and the natural capital. And there's various mechanisms, metrics, and methods. But the problem is this, is that, not the problem, but the problem we're trying to deal with is that if you measure everything in terms of GDP, which has been a long-standing discussion, what happens is that the only thing that become important are things that are measured by GDP. And so what we're hearing a lot of now, and there's huge evidence on this, is the kind of the effect in terms of mental health that COVID-19 is causing, for instance. That is having an effect on livelihoods, and ultimately measured by the SDGs, and the Secretary General has actually mentioned and referred to the need for us to better measure mental health impacts. So we have to include also the human capital as well as the social and the natural in our assessments. And certainly businesses are beginning to do this, and governments beginning to do this, and certainly UNEP is doing this more. Thanks.
Fantastic, Salman. So again, this idea of beyond GDP, and what a beautiful example just to surface sort of mental health at this particular difficult point for many people around the world as one of the things that we're probably completely missing, even when we do try to value human capital. I do want to just read what I consider unfair appreciation. It's a comment, and it starts off with the big hugs to Nicole first and foremost. Okay, so Nicole clearly is the favorite on this call, but this is a comment from Racine Kane from Senegal. Big hugs to Nicole. Oh, and Linda, says Racine. So it's just us, Steve and Salman. I apologize for that. And the comment is the so-called informal sector, which provides more than 95% of the population with jobs in Africa, is a big player. And after COVID-19, it does not seem to be the case. How can we ensure that SMMEs, which account for the informal sector, can become real players and value natural capital in a sustainable way? I'm going to hold on to that question, and I'm going to gift it to Ben for the next session that they're going to have. What I would like to do in the last, we've got 3 minutes left. I've got 4 people on, so I'm going to ask you all to quickly capture this in less than a minute each. If there was just one thing that you really would want to reinforce, to say this is the one big takeaway that I'd really love everyone from this webinar to think about as we begin to think of a post-pandemic world, what is that one thing? And can you articulate it in 30 seconds or less? Nicole and Linda, because you've unfairly got so much appreciation, I'm going to start off with you and put you on the hot spot first. And so Nicole, you go, and then we'll go to Linda next.
Okay, thank you, and hi, Racine. I'll be in on the SME webinar next week for sure. I really want to say it's not just a COVID-19 crisis. Let's not forget there's also a biodiversity crisis and a climate crisis. It's slower. It's not hitting us as rapidly and maybe in your face, but it's a slow burn, but it's going to be more serious and more difficult to overcome. We don't want to jump from the COVID-19 frying pan into the biodiversity and climate crisis fire. So I think we need to remember that as we seek to respond and recover to COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Short and sharp and concise. It's not just about COVID-19. Let's not jump from the frying pan into an even bigger fire. Linda, to you next. One takeaway from this webinar that you'd like to leave us with.
That's tough. I'll give it a try. So one thing is that we're not going to solve our current problems using the same kind of short-term thinking that got us here. We need to think longer term. We need to have a systems approach working at multiple levels. And we need to have a fundamental look at how we think about and how we achieve economic prosperity. And so rewiring our economies and businesses with a better and more complete understanding of our relationship to nature is key to building resilient green economies that are fit for the future.
Fantastic. Linda, I think you've just got it in under a minute. Thank you very much for that. Salman, let's come to you next. One takeaway that you'd really like us to engage with even after this conversation is done.
So we refer to this conversation to the COVID-19 and natural capital, but the strongest message I want to say is that please don't think that natural capital and valuation is purely techie stuff that happens out there somewhere else. All of us have an appreciation for nature. What we're trying to do as economists is engage with you, be part of a process with stakeholder dialogue, make meaningful contributions to policy dialogues by understanding what priorities are in communities, for businesses, etc., and then applying the techie methods that need to be applied, which are fairly robust at this stage, and can actually move us away from, as Linda said, a situation where nature otherwise has a zero value, which we need to avoid.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Salman. Again, coming back to one of our central themes, we've always valued nature, but if we just put in a zero. Stephen, you get to take us home today. Your one takeaway from this conversation that you'd like for us to remember.
Sure, thank you. So I think I said it in the opening remarks, but I think this crisis has served as this kind of really useful reminder that health, economic stability, and nature are all interconnected, and the response to the crisis needs to do the same. So that means governments adopting and embracing stimulus packages that promote sustainable growth, but also businesses and investors as key stakeholders actually beginning to understand and further develop ways of understanding their impacts and dependencies on nature.
Thank you very much. We circle back to the interconnectedness as a closing point, courtesy of Stephen. And what I'd like to say, firstly, a very, very huge thank you to our panelists. You really lent into the conversation and allowed us to tap into your experience to really surface some incredible insights in this conversation. Thank you to everyone from around the world that said hello and that posted a question or a comment. The chat was really, really on fire. And thank you for the difficult questions too. Thank you for pushing back against some of the ideas and really allowing us to drive a very authentic and robust conversation. I remain very, very grateful for that. If you've noticed, there were a lot of resources that were posted on the chat, so I hope that you were able to get a hold of some of those resources as well for yourself. And I think that's it, other than just to remind everyone, same time next week, it is a focus on small and medium-sized enterprises, so you don't want to miss that conversation. From my home here in Johannesburg, thank you so much for allowing me to be the facilitator of today's conversation. I hope you have a good day or evening, depending on where you are for the next couple of hours. Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.